Yeah, I don't think people realize, I didn't actually until I heard it in the film also, is that the reason that anxiety often leads to depression is because the child feels isolated. Hello, and welcome to Spiritually Hungry. The number of children diagnosed with mental health disorder, which includes depression, ADHD, and anxiety, has been steadily increasing. Even before COVID, the numbers were soaring. Our guest today is writer and producer Laura Morton. When mental health took a center stage in her family, she set out to find other families navigating the same challenges as she was finding with her daughter. This insight that she learned was so monumental, and she is here today to share with us her ideas and her amazing documentary called Anxious Nation. I highly recommend it. I walked away with so many takeaways. Welcome, Laura. We're very excited to discuss this all with you today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here and to share our film with your audience.
It's so raw. It's so real. It's obviously so personal. I thought what was really kind of the first moment that I took pause in watching it, you were saying that there are an alarming number of young people that are struggling with mental illness. And you quote the New York Times saying on April 23rd, 2022, that 3 decades ago, the gravest public health threats to teenagers in the U.S. came from binge drinking, drunken driving, teenage pregnancy, and smoking. They have since fallen sharply, replaced by a new public health concern, soaring rates of mental health disorders. And you witnessed this anxiety firsthand with your daughter, Sevi. And I believe you said that you first noticed it when she was 3 years old, but it took until she was 7 to get diagnosed. Can you tell us about your journey? And that must have been kind of terrifying and really at a loss, especially when a child's 3. And she's your first, correct?
My first and only child. And
so you had nothing to compare it with.
I also had her after 7 rounds of in vitro. I'm a single parent. I had her with a donor who I did not know. So there was this like equation in her DNA that was unrecognizable to me. And so that made things a little bit harder. I always tell people I didn't think I was really a terribly anxious person until I started making a movie about anxiety. And that ramped up my anxiety for sure. But yeah, I started noticing things with my daughter when she was quite young, and I would take her to the pediatrician, and they would immediately go to her physical health. So they wanted to point at, whatever her behavioral issues were, it was because of her diet. She wasn't getting enough fiber. She would outgrow it. There was never a thought that there might be something going on with her emotional well-being or her mental health. And I thought we had a wonderful pediatrician. I don't think it's the pediatrician's fault. I just don't think it's something we were talking about or even looking at that time. My daughter's will be 16 in July. And it actually took 7 years for us to get a proper diagnosis. And it came after taking her to again, to her pediatrician, to specialists all over and therapists. And finally, we saw somebody in Arizona that was recommended to us, Dr. Jeffrey Zeig, who's in our film Anxious Nation. And he very quickly said, you realize your daughter has anxiety, right? And it was
you had no idea. It was no thought of that at all.
Years.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, I was saying prior to that, you had no thought of that at all.
Well, no. I mean, there were some behavioral issues that were being labeled as behavior, right? So like she was withholding her bowel movements. And, that, again, we went down every imaginable and unimaginable path to try to figure out why. But no one said there's something going on with her mental health until we saw Jeff Zeig. And when he said that, it was like this giant light bulb went off. And I think, we're so really trained from a very early age to look at our physical health, right? To preserve it and be preventative and, preemptive. And, under the assumption that that's the goal, right? To have good health. But so often we separate above the neck and below the neck. We don't see it as a whole. And that really does happen, I think, a lot with our kids too, because why would a kid have a mental health issue? And, I think today, obviously, we know the statistics show that our kids are in crisis, and what was an epidemic already in 2018 when I decided, that I thought making this film was an important endeavor. 2024, I don't think there's any question that these kids are more anxious. And the statistics show it. When I started making the movie, people were like, yeah, I mean, do you really think we're more anxious, or are we just more aware of it? And today, I think we are both, right? I think we are more anxious, and I think we are more aware of it. And that if a silver lining came out of COVID and that experience for all of us, it's our willingness to have this conversation.
Well, it's interesting. A few things. One of the things that was mentioned in the documentary is that when the thing with mental illness is that it's not really visible necessarily, right? So if a child has a rash, then you get cortisone cream. If that doesn't work, then you take them to the pediatrician. If that doesn't work, then you take them to a dermatologist. And I think that that's why, as you said, it takes so many years for a family to even get a diagnosis. In fact, a lot of the parents themselves were never diagnosed. I thought that was really interesting too, when you saw the parent and the child sitting next to each other, and the children today, it seems like the expression of the anxiety is much louder. And I was thinking about, why is that? I think part of it is, well, we see everything much more heightened. It's much more emotional, right? There are school shootings, mall shootings, there's war, all of these things, and you see them all the time, even if you don't want to, right? I was standing behind somebody this past week, and I was waiting for my kids, and there was a child on social media. He was on TikTok, and he was just scrolling, and then he would stop and like something and scroll, and I could actually feel what was happening to his brain. And I was like, this is just not, and he sat there for a long time, never even realizing that I was watching. I was like pretty much over his shoulder. Like normally you'd have like that awareness, but I think kids, everything's just put upon them that even if it is, in their family, they're predisposed, it's so much more heightened in terms of how they're feeling, and they really can't escape it because it's everywhere, that fear of what's going to be, the what ifs.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, in the film, we talk about that on average, it takes families 2 to 8 years just to seek help because they don't really know what they're dealing with, right? They don't recognize it. I didn't recognize it. I was seeking help, but I was seeking help for all the wrong things. And, as a parent, I just wanted to fix the problem. I wanted to give me a label, tell me anything so we can find the solution. And I think, parents come from such a loving and pure place, and especially parents who never dealt with their own anxiety, right? They don't want their kids to feel the way they do. So they protect them. And in the process of being these loving and protective parents, we are also stripping our kids away from developing the skill set of resilience. And that is such a critical skill set to develop because life can be hard, right? Life, sometimes we will have to address things that are uncomfortable. And I think that there's been a movement for a long time of not letting our kids be in their discomfort. And I think that, it's all a big piece of it. You mentioned, the scrolling, right? I think much like a rash, which, I love that analogy that Dr. Harold Koplowitz from Child Mind Institute gives in the film. I think that the phones are something really easy for us, or the iPads or any of the devices, right? There's something really easy for us to point the finger at. And it's outside of us, right? Well, clearly it's the phones, it's the devices, it's social media. That's the problem. And I think that is a piece of the problem. But I think it would be a mistake of colossal proportion to think that if the phones didn't exist, that we would then not have an anxious generation. And when in fact, we've had an anxious generation for a very long time. I have, originally when we were making the movie, we had footage going all the way back to Eleanor Roosevelt talking about this crisis, And so it's a problem that's been around a long time, and it's the proverbial can that's been kicked for decades. And we are so far behind now that we're really grappling at anything to say, this is how we fix the problem. But anxiety in particular is not a one-size-fits-all problem, which means it cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution. So when we made the film, we thought, okay, we're going to look at the family dynamic. And because there's nature and nurture, and there's external factors. God forbid somebody experiences going through a school shooting, or any kind of trauma. And I think COVID-19 certainly was traumatic for all of us. But I think there are so many contributing factors that we have to look at and address. And I think the best place to start is within our homes. That's where I think we can affect the greatest change.
Well, it's interesting. One of the parents, I love this too, because I think you did a really great job at not making anybody feel shame for either how they parented or the anxiety that the child is experiencing, or that the parent had also experienced at some point. But the mother recognized that she was part of the issue, in that if her son was going to ride a bike and not wear a helmet, right? This was in the movie. And she realized that she'd say, I wouldn't just say, well, be careful because you could fall. She'd be careful because you could fall, then you could crack your head wide open, then your brain would never be the same. I mean, she catastrophized so much that this child was like, the sky is falling all the time, right? Which makes sense. And I think often, again, parents, I think mostly, right, if they're conscious, they're really well-meaning. And I wrote a book called Fear is Not an Option. A lot of, especially with parenting, we put our fears on our children because we want to protect them from any pain we've gone through, not realizing how it's actually hindering their growth and their inability to actually be resilient, as you said. I thought it was also another family, Noah's parents, where they said that he was crying as a baby 23 hours out of 24 hours a day. Unbelievable. But what I liked is that they were just really curious, right? Then when he couldn't fall asleep, it took 3 hours to go to bed every night. She asked her son the question, why are you afraid to fall asleep? And he said, because I know that I'm going to wake up in the morning and I'm going to feel this all again. Just like those profound bites that I don't think that often people realize that it does. It starts so young and so early, and there's so much that we actually can do. While many things were out of our control, there's a lot that is within.
Totally. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that the families that agreed to be in our film are so brave and so courageous. And the kids who appeared without their families, just on their own, really demonstrate that I think that this generation coming up has a good shot of breaking the cycle and going into the world, where they deal with their anxiety and depression and their mental health struggles in a healthy and positive way, in the same way that they would deal with any physical health struggle, right? We would treat it and not limit, sessions like they do, at college, for example. If you go, to your health center at college and you want an intake appointment to see a therapist, this is before COVID, it could take as long as 12 weeks just to get an intake appointment. And then they limit you to 5 sessions. And, these kids, they're so hyper aware now. And I just did a keynote last week in Tennessee to the state education board and all the educators around the state and politicians. And we were talking about what kids really want. And, first and foremost, they would much rather have mental health resources in school than good grades, for example. They are struggling going back to school, coming out of COVID. 50% of kids would prefer a hybrid or a remote learning situation. But we know that people who are in a fully remote learning situation have much higher rates of depression because they're isolated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot that we have to look at and balance and go, well, how can we make this better? What are the things that we can do to not only recognize there's a problem, but understand what we perhaps as parents are doing to contribute to that problem? And how do we give our kids the tools to be able to manage their emotions, to recognize those feelings when they pop up and what to do with them?
Yeah, I don't think people realize, I didn't actually until I heard it in the film also, is that the reason that anxiety often leads to depression is because the child feels isolated. And it was just like an aha moment for me, because I always thought, oh, well, I don't really understand, why does it go hand in hand? And in that part of the film, the kids were talking about body image. And And I understand that because I remember feeling insecure like that. I ended up developing anorexia when I was a teenager, and it never really created anxiety, but it created isolation and then sadness. So mine weren't as extreme, but I understood that feeling of, oh, if they always felt, right? If this started so early, and then especially when the brain is changing a lot during puberty and those years that follow, it's understandable to see like why children kind of shut down and go within, because they're misunderstood from such an early time. And then when they go through that other stage of puberty and they're feeling even different things about insecurities about their body or about their mind or what they say or do they fit in, you can see how this becomes something that feels like it's going to last forever, but it's not. It doesn't have to, right? So you mentioned some tools as well. What was the biggest thing you kind of learned in parenting Sevi through that, right? Because she's 16 now.
Yeah, she'll be 16 in July. And, she was the inspiration behind making the film. I always tell people that my decision to make the film was purely selfish on one level because I got to go around and interview all of these amazing experts. And I walked away with so much information from each one of those interviews. And I also walked away feeling like I was doing it all wrong, right? Like really bad about myself because I would walk away going, well, that makes so much sense. Of course, that's why, And on the other hand, it was very selfless because I knew that if I was gaining that kind of knowledge and takeaway from these conversations, I knew so many other families would benefit too. My biggest takeaway, there's a couple of things, and Sevi and I talk about this a lot. First and foremost, I think making the film gave us a common language to talk about this. And I think so often when we talk about mental health, it's something different to everyone, right? So if you talk about mental health, a lot of people who are just having a bad day, look at that as their mental health. And, some people think of mental health as schizophrenia or bipolar disease. And some people think mental health is going to the spa and taking care of yourself, right? That's all under that umbrella of mental health. But I think when we have a common language to be able to talk about it and we can be on the same page, I think that communication then gets better. And so there are so many, like Lynn Lyons in this movie, I think is such a rock star. And
I have so many things I want to talk about that she said, which we'll get to. But I want to ask you one question before you say that. Do you think that part of the issue with how to deal with mental health is that people are not comfortable with the term mental illness and what falls under that? So like schizophrenia, for instance, right? I have an uncle who is. Mental illness, that name, terrified me my whole life. And then when we talk about depression, that's also mental illness. Part of anorexia is also mental illness. So I just think that part of the problem is the umbrella in which it's under.
You have to have a better definition, right? I think that this all needs a rebranding across the board.
I think so. Yes.
And, that's my feeling. And this is why the tagline for our movie is harnessing anxious energy for good, right? Mm-hmm. Because that energy can actually work for you. It can work against you. But if you learn how to take that energy and repurpose it, it can work for you. And you see that a really easy way to understand that is that you look at elite athletes who take that nervous energy and they use it for performance, right? We see it with musicians. I mean, how often do we hear about pop stars who will tell you they're terribly anxious? Or actors. Emma Stone won the Oscar this year. She's really struggles with her anxiety, but she takes that energy and she uses it in a positive way. And I think that if we could rebrand that terminology, I think that would be a really good place to start. And I think it would put all of us on the same page, right? That was my point in saying, what is mental health or mental illness? It's something different to everyone. It's how you process those two words together. So I think you're exactly right. And I wish I had the answer because I would patent it. And, but I don't have the answer, but I do think that I think that the connection lies in no longer disconnecting physical health and emotional health. It's health, right? And I think we have to treat it exactly the same. So if you're going to watch your carb intake and do a lot of cardio and, you're on, I don't know, intermittent fasting or whatever it is that you do for your physical health, you have to, in the same way, look at nurturing your emotional health, all at the same time.
And
I
how you
just, most
process.
people go, oh, sorry, most people only, they only deal with their emotional health and their mental health when they're in crisis, right? And the problem is we're only putting out fires when we're in crisis. We're never getting to the arsonist. What's lighting those fires?
So you were saying before, and I also wanted to, if you can go a little bit deeper into the parenting side of this, right? Like the movie shows, and I think many parents are not aware of the great influence that they actually have on their children, whether they're developing mental illness issues or not. So maybe you can talk a little bit, maybe even personally, how you change your view about how to parent, or any advice you can give to our parents listening, keeping this in mind.
I'd like to just go back and just say, the common language was something that was really important that I took away. And the second thing was recognizing how my daughter feels is legit to her and not putting my own perspective on that. Right. And to that point, I think that's really one of the things that I learned as a parent. So often we want our kids to be high achieving, high performing. You've got to get good grades. You have to go to college. You have to go to Ivy League school, whatever the messaging is. And there's a great scene in the film that most people find very uncomfortable to watch.
The mother-daughter on the couch. I had to walk away and pause it and then put it back on again. And I was upset. I felt the pain of the child. But go ahead, just tell this. That is like you guys have to watch this. You have to watch this.
Yeah. Well, and I will tell you. So first, I'll tell your listeners about the scene, because even me telling you about it will not in any way detract from when you actually see it, right? Yeah. But there's a scene where there's a mother who is sitting with her daughter, who is an actress, and she's a songwriter and singer, and she's fantastic. And it's Cooper and her mom, Jackie. And they're having this conversation that starts off as being so like mother-daughter real. And then Jackie just starts pouring her own needs and unfulfilled
dreams,
I would say, right? Yeah. And, her unfulfilled dreams and living vicariously through her child, and just saying to her, I don't understand why you can't get these auditions. I mean, if I were auditioning, I'd be getting every single one of them. And, and you could see the angst in this child's face. And we knew when we were filming it that she was going down a path that, of course, as filmmakers, we wanted to protect her from. So much so, you'll find this really interesting, that when we decided to use it in the film, I went to Jackie and I shared it with her. And I said, hey, I don't want you to suffer for being authentic on film. And if you want us to take this scene out, we will. Probably. And she watched it and she said, I would like you to leave it in. Because if other parents can see themselves in that scene, if they can just take a step back, take a beat and go, do I do that? Then it's worth putting in. And we see it all the time, like on the sports fields, right? The parents who are on the sidelines screaming and yelling and getting in the coach's face and the referees and putting this pressure on their kids. We see it, academically, we see it in a lot of different ways. I give her so much respect for allowing us to use that, because the idea is, if we hold up the mirror, right, you have two choices. You can see the reflection or you can break the mirror, right? If you don't like the reflection, breaking the mirror is not going to change a thing. But if you can see the behavior, and you can have an important conversation with your partner, your husband, your wife, your children, because of that, things can only get better, right? And recognizing that it isn't about being a perfect parent, but it is about doing better and being more aware and being a conscious parent. So I think that that is one of those scenes that everybody talks about it. And I'm curious to know if, when you watched the film, if you had any dialogue about yourselves after watching that scene. I mean, clearly, Monica, you had to walk away, so it poked at something, right?
I felt the pain of the child, right? I think as parents, we all have those moments where we're like, oh, I could have done better. I've really trained myself. We have 4 kids that we own if we feel like we did something wrong. And it's a look that, especially my youngest, I'll see something in her eyes and 5 minutes later, I'll be like, oh, that wounded her in some way. And I'll go back and say, did what I just said hurt you in some way? I'm sorry. This is what I meant. Like, I'll always own it. So it was just, I really felt the pain of the child, because at one point when the mom was like, if it was me, I would do this. And if it was me, I would do that. And if I could go back and do it all over again. And the daughter, in almost an audible voice, says, you would do, if I could go back. And then the daughter says, you would do it over again. And she's like, no, I would nail it was just like a different response. Right. And I'm like, no, that's not what she needs to hear. But did Jackie have, like, after seeing herself, because the mirror thing, right? When you see yourself and you're kind of watching it, I've had that experience with people that I work with where I videotape them and then they're like in total denial about an addiction or whatever. And then they go back and look at it. They're actually shocked, right? Was that kind of like her experience? Was she surprised, or was it just more of like an awareness of something she needs to work on?
I don't think she was surprised at all. And in many ways, she is the quintessential stage mother, right? And we've all seen examples of that over the years. Brooke Shields' mother, many, many parents who take on that role. So I don't think she was surprised. I think that she did take a deep breath and talk about, like, the need to address that within herself, right? Because this is all her old stuff. And and also there's a scene in the movie where Jackie's talking to her mother, so it's multi-generational, and her mother was talking about how Jackie was at that age. And so you see that this is a family line. And so that's what's, if you will, normal in that family. But no, I don't think Jackie was particularly surprised. I think if she had been, she might have been more reticent for us to use the clip. But I do think that what it helped her understand is that she still has work to do. And we're all work in progress, right?
We all do. Yeah.
It reminds me, what I thought as I was watching that part of the film was that a few weeks ago, Monica mentioned, I think, that our youngest daughter, Abigail, gets worried about missing flights. And we were flying from LA to New York. We came to the airport. And as we're trying to check in, they're telling us there's a problem with our ticket.
Well, they saw the ticket, but they couldn't print the boarding pass. So it's weird. Like now 20 minutes before the flight, and we're still at the ticket counter. And Abigail's like, she starts to do her thing where,
Yeah, so it took about 45 minutes for them to figure it out. It was getting really close to the flight. Luckily, the flight was delayed. But what I was very conscious of is that she was watching Monica and I, how we're reacting.
And we knew she was watching.
So I was not going to raise my voice, even if I would have wanted to. I would not be showing frustration, even if I would have wanted to, because I knew this was going to directly impact not only her experience now, but her long-term experience. So I think
we actually really overly calmed ourselves. We were like, okay, if not, there's another flight. So what do you want to do when we get back to New York? Like, and meanwhile, I'm thinking, I really don't want to miss this flight. We better make the flight. But we are consciously putting a different energy out.
Yeah, and I think sorry.
I think that you using the word conscious there is so important, right? We have another expert in our film, Dr. Shefali, who wrote a book called Conscious Parenting. And it's, it really is about being aware, and that you had that self-awareness in that moment, knowing your, daughter was watching you, is extraordinary, that you had that ability to recognize that and then act on it. A lot of parents get caught up in the moment because they're just more about the self, right? And I certainly have, I've done both, but I certainly, have had my share of those moments. And of course, it has an impact on our kids, and especially as they're developing. And so for me, I think you should be applauded for having that mindset in the moment, because the gift that you give your child for how you respond, right? Because that is what this is all about, right? It's about our response to fill in the blank. Is it anxiety? Is it, fear? Is it whatever, the word is that you want to put into that blank? How do you respond? Because you do have control over how you respond. And that's part of putting those tools in the toolkit.
Mm-hmm. So we were talking about Lynn Lyons. Again, all the guests that you had on the they're phenomenal. I was really impressed with her, and I thought this was so interesting. I've never heard anybody kind of put this in this way. She said that a child becomes like, or can become like, the cult leader, right? Where
the fear, right? The fear,
the anxiety, not the child.
The anxiety,
that's a big difference, right? Yeah.
So that all, for instance, all, including the parents, need to go to bed at the same time, right? That only one restaurant is the one that, chosen that makes the child comfortable, and soon all follow. And then the world becomes smaller, which I thought was so interesting, because I don't think anybody realizes that that's what's happening. When anxiety is allowed to be in the driver's seat, then everything else is secondary. And before you know it, you're not really treating the child or the symptoms. You're not dealing with the issue. And then the other example that was given is that parents who parent with tough love, they recognize that this isn't a good model, allowing anxiety to be the driver, but tough love's not necessarily the solution either. So can you expound upon that a little bit as well?
100%, because the cult leader analogy that comes sort of hand in hand with doing the disorder, right, which is another Lynn Lyons term, that was like earth shattering to me. Like, it was just like, it was one of my biggest ahas was hearing her describe that, because I was the parent who absolutely was adhering to everything that the cult leader wanted in our home. And the cult leader was not my child. The cult leader was the anxiety that, engulfed my child. And so it was just easier as a single parent trying to put her to bed, and, I'm already exhausted, and, trying to get her to stay in her bed. And, finally you just go, fine, get in my bed, because you just want to go to sleep. Right. Where do you want to have dinner? If I wanted Chinese and she wanted pizza, 100% we were going for pizza. I just didn't have that, that strength at the end of my day to have those battles. And I did her a great disservice by giving in all the time. And what Lynn says so beautifully in the film is when you give in to the cult leader, it actually makes the anxiety stronger and stronger and stronger. And, and it really is dictating everything that you do, whether you can, get a babysitter and go out with your friends and have some adult time, everything. And we don't realize as parents that we're in that cult, if you will.
And then how did you change that from going, because that's a strong energy, right? Anxiety in itself, but then when you're adhering to all that it's requesting, all of the demands, and then that becomes a pattern and that becomes routine. And that's what then the whole family knows, right? You're not really fully aware of what's going on, but then that's how you're living. How do you switch that? How does one go about it?
So it has to be systemic, right? It can't just be one parent. Both parents have to be on board, and both parents have to follow through with what the, not giving into the cult leader. So kind of, saying, we're not comfortable with this anymore. And it's like ferberizing a baby, right? And, eventually they will go to sleep in their crib, and but it really does involve a reset, but it cannot be. So when you talk about one parent who is totally servicing the cult leader, and you've got one parent who's a tough love parent, if those two parents cannot get on the same page, the child suffers, right? Because they both think that what they're doing is right. And it's such a mixed message to the child. So what needs to happen is systemic change within the home. And then add in one more thing to that equation when you've got other children in that equation. And the one anxious child gets 85 or 90% of the attention. And you've got these other kids who really aren't demonstrating any signs of real anxiety. They're going to bed. They don't care where you have dinner. They don't care what movie you watch. They in many ways, that creates a situation among the siblings too. So if I act like this, maybe I'll get more attention. So I think that it's really important, if you become aware that you're doing this in your home, one, I think seek some professional help and guidance through these changes, because it starts with parenting, right? And so I thought I was being a good parent. I genuinely thought I was being a good parent. I also genuinely knew that there were times that I took the path of least resistance, and that's where it got me, right? So I think that you have to start with either seeking some professional help or reading. There are some very good books out there that talk about how to get on the same page and not nurture the anxiety and the struggles.
How quickly did Sevi turn around with that, right? Because I would imagine that's a hard transition or shift for her, especially, right? Because it's uncomfortable. Change is especially uncomfortable, the unknown, right? So was that difficult for her?
Very difficult. We still struggle with it. My daughter still, from time to time, wants to sleep in my bed. And, now I'm at a place where I'm like, well, she's going to be out of the house in 2 years. Sure, come on. But I mean, it's still a struggle. I think it hasn't fully gone away in our house. But I would say what happened in our house, once we became aware of the cult leader and doing the disorder, which is the same behaviors that strengthen the cult leader, right? So once you become aware of it, COVID happened. So we were home, we were in lockdown, and everything changed, right? Things you just went for what I think felt right in the moment. So it took us a little time to undo some of that. I would say we're 80% there. And I'm good with that. I don't know that you ever get to 100%, but maybe you do. But to your point, these were habits that were developed and nurtured for a really, really long time in our home. And so that's comfortable for her. And I think the biggest thing that we're dealing with now is having Sevi really get comfortable in her discomfort.
Mm-hmm. That's such a good point. We talk to our children about that a lot. I think, again, a lot of parents make the mistake of, if your child is healthy, they'll be happy all the time. That's not possible. Are you happy all the time? Am I happy all the time? If your child's healthy, then you fill in the blank, so you don't allow for discomfort's a very, very important part of life. And failure is very important, and rejection and negative feelings, they're all part of life, so that we can appreciate the times that we do feel good, so that we can seek out experiences that make us feel good, right? So I think that balance, having that conversation with your children, no matter if they're very anxious or they're just worried, because all children experience this, all adults experience this. I was just thinking, for our listeners, we have so many, I work with so many couples, and parenting is another big source of argument. They're not on the same page. Their styles are not the same. Then you add in a child that has any difference, whether it be a learning difference or emotional or whatever, and then they find a different way to kind of handle it. And I want our listeners to take pause for a moment and really think about this, right? Is your parenting style bringing you further away from one another? And how is that negatively impacting your children? Because again, in the documentary, it talks about nature versus nurture. And I think Lynn Line says, if it's nurture, it's your fault, and if it's nature, it's your fault. Something like that.
She says, if it's nature, it's you. If it's nurture, it's you.
Right. And
so it really, when you think about it, it's so true, right?
Right.
I mean, there are obviously some extenuating circumstances that can happen in families: sudden death, a school shooting. A lot of families right now are really struggling with what's happening in the Middle East. There's lots of things that can create trauma in a family, right? And but the reality is that as a parent, it really does sort of start with you, nature or nurture, right? There are some kids that are born more anxious, right? They just are. Like, some kids are born to play the piano, and so what do we do with that? And with my daughter, you bring up something so interesting, because I hadn't thought about this in so long. You talk about failure. And when Sevi would come home from school when she was younger, I would say to her, "How was your day?" And she would always go, "Great." Right. And my second question was always, "Tell me something you tried and failed at today."
Amazing.
And that opened up a dialogue to normalize and put a high value on failure. Right. And that was always where I got better information about her day. And the other thing that I did for her is I put up a sign in her room when she was very young. If she was sitting here right now, she would tell you exactly what I'm about to say. And I put the word fear up on a big piece of paper in her bedroom. And I wrote out, false evidence appearing real, because my daughter was very fearful growing up. And I taught her at a very young age to understand that the mind can't differentiate between a real and imagined thought. So you can think something, but it doesn't make it real, right? And that happens a lot with kids, who are like the monster under the bed or whatever it is that they fear. And so I wanted to give her those two tools. Whether she reached back and pulled them out was really on her, but just asking your child, what's something you tried and failed at today, will open up a dialogue that will be so different than how was your day.
We do that. It's interesting too. I think what children fear a lot is their thoughts. And if you don't give them the space to express them, then they stay in them and then they grow. And I think you're an exceptional mother, by the way, really. Like because I mean, what makes a parent great, in my opinion, is that their desire to understand their child and to help them navigate their own journey. And at the same time, being introspective of how we should be changed by parenting. And you're doing that. I mean, that's what we try to do as well. But really, kudos.
Oh, coming from you, that means the world. Thank you so much. Every parent loves to hear that they're doing better, right? And it's been a road for us. Like, I went and made a movie. I'm an author by trade, right? And I didn't think this was a book. I actually felt like it was so important for people to see, not only see this, because I felt like they needed to be seen and heard themselves, right? I want people to watch Anxious Nation and see, they may not see themselves in every scene in the film, right? But there are bits and pieces all throughout the film where you can walk away and go, that's our family too. And that's what we chose to be in the film.
The drawings were phenomenal that also supported, and the cartoons. You brought in Betty Boop. I mean, come on. Who doesn't love Betty Boop? But the drawings were, yeah, I mean, really amazing. What were you going to say?
No, so I was going to add one of the, I think, profound, I would say, a teaching that I saw in the film, which I think is important not only for parents and children who are dealing with anxiety. We know a lot of adults who deal with their own anxiety. And there was a phrase there, I believe it was, that anxiety does not have a lot of tools in its toolkit. Right?
It doesn't. It does the same thing over and over. And when you learn that, because, for us, I felt like anxiety was lurking in my home, right? I felt like if I walked through the door, anxiety, I always imagined, it's a vivid analogy, but I'll share it with you. I imagine anxiety with a 2x4 just whacking me the second I walked in the door, because I never quite knew what was making my daughter anxious today, because what made her anxious yesterday might not be the thing that triggers her today, right? It's a shapeshifter. But what we came to understand, and this is so valuable in our family, was that anxiety does the same thing over and over and over. It doesn't really matter how it's presenting, because those feelings are really your fight or flight response, right? So they're natural feelings. And you were meant to have those feelings in the right circumstances. So it's really recognizing, I know this, I understand it, and I know what to do, regardless of the why or the how.
Yeah, and when I saw that, I think part of what I understood, and tell me if this is what you were trying to express, is that it's not this powerful sort of, huge monster you're fighting. It's really, it's kind of diminishes its power over us, over any individual, knowing that it's actually just doing the same thing over and over and over again.
So more it's like an energy, right? You can't take it seriously necessarily, but you have to take it seriously enough to do something with it. But at the end of the day, it is just an energy that needs to be directed, right?
Very much so. That's what we feel. And yet we're seeing the impact on our children in exponential ways. And so what can, where do we go from here, right? Because you don't really want to minimize it. And it's not really the school's job. And, this is why at the beginning of our conversation, I said, it really has to start at home. Systemic change will start at home. Our federal government is failing us. Our state governments are failing us. Our local governments are failing us. So because, schools don't have the resources. They don't have the education. They don't have the money. They don't have, the ability to be able to do the things that they would like to do. They can have all the conferences that they want to have, but they still have to implement it. And we live in a world today where they're so afraid of triggering that they're not really able to affect great change, right? So where do we go from here? Because I'm sure you're highly aware of the statistics, and they're so much worse than they were before COVID. And Dr. Vivek Murthy has talked a lot about the crisis of isolation and loneliness, which I think is the bigger crisis in the overall, right? I think that we've got a generation of incredibly lonely, isolated, and disconnected kids. And the question is, why? And it isn't just the phones, right? So when you have a kid who has anxiety, and Lynn says this in the movie, when you isolate them and you leave them alone with their thoughts and you take away hope, right? That's when we put them at the greatest risk. So the thing that we really have to look at is, how do we inspire hope? This, and not talking about it with a sense of permanence, right? This is who you are. You'll deal with this the rest of your life. If we don't label that way, and we say, there are things you can do to manage this, and and here are 3 things you can do right now. That 5-5 rule that's in the movie that one of our kids talk about. 5 things you can taste, 5 things you can smell, 5 things you can touch. It's so easy, and anybody can do it. And it really does take your anxiety level down. The conversations are so important, but it can't just end with talking about it. And I think awareness is everything. And I hope that your listeners will come away from this episode with, one, wanting to watch Anxious Nation, which is available on Amazon and iTunes. But 2, wanting to have difficult and important conversations within their home, whether it's with the couple or the family as a whole, because this impacts, systemically, it impacts the entire family. And it's really important to know that, and so that everybody can be in sync, in the same step.
Also, there was a part in the film about how it's natural for children, adults of course too, but to want to belong and to have a sense of belonging, right? This idea of, like, if your child comes home and says, oh, I want this shoe or that boot or this thing, it's not because they just want more things. It's because that's part of belonging to a group of people who are wearing those things. And that, I think, again, sometimes we might see if our child doesn't fit in per se, or that they are not part of a group, we worry. We get fearful that, oh, they're going to be rejected. No one's going to like them, then be alone. Wrong approach. It would be better to understand that sense of belonging is natural. It's innate in all of us because it's part of our survival. We need to belong in a group to survive, and to see how you can nurture your unique child, whatever they look like, however they present themselves. And my youngest daughter and I wrote a book called The Gift of Being Different. And it's a series of 10 children's books, and it's about how your difference is your superpower, and hers is dyslexia. But this idea of really finding the part of yourself that feels the most different, and understand that it's the most powerful, unique part of you. You just need to learn how to use it and, like, grow into it, right?
Yeah, it's Dan Siegel says in the film that belonging for the mind is like breathing for the body.
Yes, I love that. Say that again. That was one of my favorite quotes as well.
Belonging, yeah, it's Dan Siegel, who's also just brilliant. He says in the movie that belonging for the mind is like breathing for the body.
So powerful.
It's essential. We all want to belong. I want to belong. My daughter wants to belong. When you asked me, before we started your recording, you asked how my daughter was doing, and I said she's finding her tribe. Your kids will find their tribe. They'll find their people. It might take them a little more time. But they'll find their people. In the meantime, be their people.
Yeah, my youngest watches Girl Meets World, and she's always like, I want a bay window, and I want that friend. I'm like, you're going to find her one day, I promise. I'm like, you're so unique and special. You're going to find that same kindred spirit. But yeah, it's a natural desire.
It is.
One of the, I think really important, you call them skills in the film, to normalize the conversation and to name it. Can you share with us a little bit what you mean by that?
Sure. That's another Lynn Lyons brilliant moment on the film when she's just, name Fred, like name anxiety, give it a name, right? Fred, we'll call him Fred. And, and know that when Fred shows up, recognize it. And this is what we're going to do when Fred shows up. And what's so great in the movie, it's an old cartoon. What's so great about the cartoons in the movie is how well we didn't write the movie to the cartoons, right? Some of these cartoons are 70, 80 years old. And it tells you that this has been a part of our lives for a very long time, right? So the scene in the movie is we're talking about what to do when Fred shows up is, I don't remember who's flying the plane with, but it's a cartoon and he's flying a plane and these saws come and just saw the wings off the plane and you think the plane's going to go down, but along come two birds and they become the wings and they start flapping. So the plane just keeps flying. And that's a perfect analogy for what we need to do when we face these struggles. Know that they're, how we respond, that we could panic and the plane goes down, right? Or we can go, no, there's a solution and along come the birds and we keep flying. And so it really is about recognizing that feeling. I used to say to my daughter, what does anxiety feel like? How do you know you're getting anxious? And she would always say, it starts in my toes. My toes begin to curl. And so she would know that when she would start curling her toes, that feeling was about to take over. And I think if you ask your kids, what does anxiety feel like to you? You won't get the same answer from all your kids, that's for sure, because it's something different. But then ask yourself, what do you feel like when you're anxious? How do you recognize that behavior? Because when you're anxious and you have this wonderful response at the airport, but a lot of parents don't. So how do you recognize it so that you can be a better example for your kids?
And with Sevi, you found, well, by the way, do you mind sharing what name did she give the anxiety? Did she give a name?
She did. I want to say Eliza, because she was totally, it was very short-lived for us, but she was totally obsessed with Hamilton. And so I think she named her anxiety Eliza. And yes. And it was a really helpful thing for us. My daughter was going into her teenage years while we were filming, right? She was 11 when we started filming, and the film opens on her bat mitzvah.
Right.
And so as she was going through some of that, she was a teenager. She didn't want to name her anxiety. She said, that's stupid, right? Whatever it was. But it's a helpful tool, especially for younger kids who can't articulate as well. And so, yeah, I think it's a wonderful tool that if you can share that. And what's great, because as a parent, you can say, is Fred here? Is Eliza here?
Right.
And that's it. Doesn't that sound a little friendlier than like, are you anxious?
We would have Abigail and I would have a code word every time she felt uncomfortable and didn't want to say it out loud or didn't want to speak in front of anybody. And she would just say the word and then we'd leave the room and have like a quiet talk on the side.
Yeah.
So I know also in the film, and also you mentioned that, social media isn't the 100% of the problem, but what would your recommendations be around social media and kids?
Well, I have really strong feelings about this. I find, so first of all, there's this scene in the movie where my daughter, admits that she's averaging 9 to 11 hours a day on her phone. In all fairness, that was in the middle of COVID, so that is all she was doing, right? But she still averages significant. And I think on average, most kids are around 9 hours right now. And let's just say that they're in school for 6 hours a day. So do the math on that. It's a lot of screen time. And we know without a question, there is a great correlation to when, these devices were introduced, and we know the damage that these social media channels are having on our kids. I am of the opinion that we need to hold these companies to a higher standard, especially the social media companies, because I think that they're well aware, and we talk about this in the film. We have Frances Haugen in the film who testified. Right. She was the whistleblower from Facebook, from Meta. And she testified in Washington that these companies know the damage that they're doing, and they're not only continuing to do it, but they're looking for new and better ways to create more damage. They actually employ psychologists and psychiatrists and professionals that work on the algorithms that are designed to draw us in. And that's why we scroll and scroll and we go down the rabbit hole. And, for a kid who's suicidal, or for a kid who has an eating disorder, or for, you name it, there's a rabbit hole for each and every one of those things. And these are designed to pull your kids into that darkness. Parents often overlook gaming, that Fortnite is one of the top breeding grounds for sexual predators of young boys. And so, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And these companies are protected under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and a law that went into effect in 1996. So it predates all of these platforms, right? And it basically says that they are not held liable or responsible for any third-party postings on their on their apps. And it's gone to the Supreme Court numerous times. And I don't think we're going to see that law changed anytime soon. Obama tried to change it. Trump tried to change it. Tech is so deep in the pockets of our politicians that it'll never change. The only workaround that I think could make a difference is going after these companies for the algorithms, because the algorithms are really changeable. They have total control over those algorithms and should be held responsible for those algorithms. I think we are so far down the path with our devices and our phones. I think that even if you take them away during the school day, that, these kids are still learning on a laptop, right? They still have to turn in their work through Google, through Google and Google Classroom. So for me, I think trying to limit, especially kids who are younger, hold off as long as you can from giving your kids a phone. I think not giving your kids a phone is not really a viable option, but there are phones you can give them that don't have access to any of these things. I applaud Snapchat for taking the friend ranking off last week. They decided that they're doing that. I think we need to take the Snap Maps off as well. So I think slowly we're going to see some changes. But I think for every positive change that we see, there will be something that comes in and replaces it that we as parents have to be on top of and make sure that our kids understand there is an effect. And I know that when I no longer take my daughter's phone away from her as a punishment for a lot of reasons, probably a much longer conversation than I think we have time for today. But I don't take her phone away from her because that is her belonging. We were just talking about this, right? That's her sense of connection. As a teenage girl, as a 15 or 16-year-old girl, that is how they connect. And I don't want to take that away from her. So we have found other things. I don't allow her to have her phone while she's doing homework. And yet, I think that there are positive things that we can see from our devices as well, right? I.e., that sense of belonging, that sense of connection, finding a community that you can relate to. I think there's a lot of things that we can look at and go, well, there is some good that comes from this. But I don't think that anybody should be allowed to Google, how do I kill myself? Exactly. How do I make a bomb? Right? Exactly. And I think that we need to hold these companies to a higher standard. I hope I answered your question. I'm very passionate about this subject.
No, we're with you.
I feel like the pointing of the finger at the devices is just low-hanging fruit. I think it's so easy. It's like that rash, right? We can see it, we can understand it, and it's outside of us, which means I'm not the problem. That is. Absolutely. And I think we have to, in the words of Taylor Swift, hi, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me.
Have you gone with your daughter to a Taylor Swift concert yet?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay. We saw her in Atlanta and had a wonderful time. And there are so many good role models out there right now for young girls. And young girls are really, really struggling. Young boys are too, but young girls in much higher numbers. And I love some of the role models who are coming out and really spreading a message of positivity and having a positive impact on our kids. I appreciate it so much. Anybody who's talking about their mental health right now, I honor and respect. Anybody who is willing to share their story openly with the hope of having others feel seen and heard, bravo.
Well, Abigail and I were at Target over the weekend, and there were all of these TVs playing, and they had Simone Biles competing, and I stopped, and I'm like, oh, I just love her. I respect her so much. And I was like, you really like her? Because I think I've said it before, and she kind of started connecting the dots. And I said, she's so brave to have left the Olympics for her mental health because she knew she was struggling. So we had this great conversation. And I said, Abby, I just think she's such a great role model to show what being strong really looks like. Sometimes it's walking away from the thing that you want the most because you know it's not good for you in that moment. And I think it's those kinds of conversations.
Yeah. There is a movie on HBO called Chasing Gold, and it follows, I don't know, a dozen Olympic athletes. And it's a really powerful movie. Not as powerful as Anxious Nation. You should definitely watch it. It's a really powerful movie because it shows, you know, the commitment that it takes for these athletes who are not paid, right? And, you know, they're in it for the glory, for the win. And, you know, the win, if you're a bronze medalist in the Olympics, nobody remembers your name, right? So it talks a lot about the mental health struggles. And the United States Olympic Committee does not take care of these kids. And, you know, I think it's so important. You know, we put all the pressure on these athletes to go win for America. And then you come home and you need, you know, I think resources available to you. And so hopefully we can do better, right? But I think you're so right. Like, I think anybody who has the courage to walk away, and we've seen it with a lot of these athletes, you know, Naomi Osaka, like, you know, a lot of these athletes talk about their anxiety. A lot of them talk about how they use it for performance. But, you know, I think that anybody who is willing to share their story and willing to step into taking care of themselves first is spreading the right message.
Exactly.
I was going to say that there's a part towards the end where they speak about being of service, right? Which is an interesting paradox because we're talking about taking care of yourself, but one of the tools, I guess, of this is both probably for children and adults as well. And it reminded me of something my mother, who passed away a few years ago, would always say: if you're feeling down, go and do something for somebody else. And I thought that was such an important message, you know, for anybody struggling with any type of anxiety. I was wondering if you or Sevi have you used that tool, and how has it an influence?
We have. We went with a group to build homes in Mexico for needy families who were literally, when we showed up, they were living in, like, I wouldn't even call them homes. Their roofs were like hefty bags. And, you know, we built these homes over the course of a weekend. And Sevi got to hand the keys to this incredible home with like indoor plumbing and things that we take for granted, right? And Sevi didn't have the ability, so these kids just spoke Spanish. And Sevi didn't have the ability, but we brought nail polish and Hot Wheels with us. And talk about a universal language, right? Yes. Every girl wanted Sevi to paint their nails, and every boy was like, love the little car. And so she got to hang out with the kids, but she swung a hammer. She painted the house. Like, she was very much a part of it. The other thing that Sevi does, and I'm so proud of her for this, is that she has become a mental health youth advocate. So she works with the Born This Way Foundation. She works with UCLA, and she, you know, she comes on the road with me quite often to share her story with the hopes of inspiring other kids that they're not to feel weird or like an outsider, that this is like, you know, we're all going through this, and you're going to be cool because, like, I got through it too, you know? And so I give her so much credit for that, because the only place that Sevi's not allowed me to show the film is her high school. And, you know, anybody in her high school can watch it, you know, they'd have to go, you know, and stream it. But we've done screenings all over the country. And when Sevi comes to these screenings, she's the superstar, because hearing from the kids, directly from the kids about their experiences is everything. Right. I can only tell you what it's like for me as a parent. I cannot tell you what it was to literally what Sevi felt. Only Sevi can tell you that. And I think it's so important. And I think it's so great that she wants to take her time to do that. So thank you for asking that question. And I think a lot of kids have that ability, right? I think just checking in with your friends. And you can be, in grade school, middle school, high school, college, you could be our age. Checking in with your friends is a really easy thing to do. Not shooting them a text, pick up the phone, call them. If it's kids, shoot them a text, send them a snap. How are you? Just checking in.
Well, yeah, I mean,
it's such an easy thing to do.
Whatever we're feeling.
Elmo created this like universal therapy session a month ago, right?
Right.
I was going to say, whatever we're feeling, if we're feeling insecure, we're feeling down, chances are somebody else is feeling the exact same thing. Again, to different degrees, but that's why whenever I kind of feel something, then I force myself to go and check in on somebody else. It's the easiest way to get out of your own head.
It is, but it's also being of service.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Exactly. It's checking in is a piece of the equation. Actually taking the time to listen is the other half, right? And I think that people are so overwhelmed. I occasionally will write handwritten notes and just send them in the mail. Nobody does it anymore. But how great is it to go to the mailbox and get a handwritten letter from someone?
Totally.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
No. So first, we want to thank you for joining us. We said we recommend every one of our listeners to watch Anxious Nation.
So go to anxiousnation.com to check out your website, Lauren's website. Your IG is @AnxiousNation, and the film can be watched on Prime. And where else?
On iTunes. So you can get it on Prime and iTunes. And if you're interested in having a community screening, as we talked about, throughout this episode, we love doing those. We think they're terrific. And it's a great way for everybody to connect. You said something so interesting, like, oftentimes somebody else is feeling down too. I think today, if you find somebody that's not dealing with anxiety, that's the rarity, right?
I love that. We're actually having a big group come together in 2 weeks. So if we can pull it off quickly, maybe we'll do a screening then. If not, for sure. Listeners, guys, I'm telling you, you have to watch this film. You will definitely, there's so many gems and nuggets, whether you're a parent or not. Everybody knows somebody who is struggling, and even it might just resonate with your own experience today. So really, Lauren, thank you so much for joining us, and well done.
Monica and Michael, thank you.